Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Patrick Allitt, professor of American history at Emory College and author of Climate of Crisis, America in the Age of Environmentalism. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Patrick, you wrote a piece in the Weekly Standard last year titled Remember the Future, which is one of my favorite expressions because it so succinctly captures an exercise in understanding that's almost pathologically neglected by much of the intelligentsia and virtually all the media. I'd like you to pair that thought up with Abraham Lincoln's famous quote about fooling some of the people all the time as you refresh us on the history of American environmentalism. How bad was life supposed to be right now, according to many honored environmental sages of the past?
Well, in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, there were a lot of predictions that the world by the year 2000 or the early 21st century was going to be catastrophic. The claims included the idea that the population was going to be so high that we'd run out of food and that we'd be using up raw materials so rapidly that there'd be nothing left by the year 2000. And so some very influential scientists and government commissions wrote reports predicting catastrophe. And one of the great pleasant surprises of the last 50 years has been to discover that we can have economic growth, we can actually reduce pollution, and we're not facing starvation or exhaustion of resources.
What's the tradition of Jeremiah, and how deeply rooted is it in Western culture?
Well, Jeremiah is one of the biblical prophets who curses the people for their neglect of God.
Mm-hmm.
And the Jeremiah is a kind of Puritan sermon in which the Puritans themselves worried that they were turning away from God and turning too much towards worldly things. So even as the Puritan colonies became more and more successful, their ministers were warning that they were going to bring down on their heads a terrible vengeance. The Jeremiah certainly survives today in religious form, but also in secular form, and some of the more pessimistic environmentalists were themselves issuing what were in effect secular versions of the Jeremiah tradition.
There does seem to be a religious thread, even though there's not a God figure behind much of environmentalism.
Yes, I think the intensity with which environmental views are held does tiptoe right up to the brink of spiritual intensity.
Let's look at some practical things. How much better off would we be today if our great-grandparents and other forebears had exercised greater prudence in utilizing natural resources? For example, if we had never learned to use fossil fuels or had vastly restricted their use, where would we be today?
Well, we'd be living a much, much poorer life. Life expectancy would be shorter. All kinds of health problems would be much more serious. We'd have a high infant mortality rate. There's no question that the only way humanity has ever discovered to get out of mass poverty is through industrialization. And obviously, fossil fuels have been central to the Industrial Revolution. So we can be very glad that our grandparents did use fossil fuels and used them with growing enthusiasm. Although they create pollution, they bring an enormous amount of good with them. And we've discovered that we can manage the pollution. So when I hear claims that we need to be thinking about our grandchildren in the debate over climate change, I always think, well, should my grandparents have been more restrained in their use of resources? And my answer is no, that they did the right thing.
Well, this certainly worked for us. Is it any less true for developing nations like China or India when they use energy?
China and India are currently going through their own industrial revolutions, and it's dirty. There's no question that in its early stages, an industrial revolution tends to be dirty. But as the society gets wealthier, which it always does with industrialization, it then starts to devote more and more of its resources to cleaning up. So I think that when you hear about the terrible air in Beijing or Mumbai today, you need to compare it with Pittsburgh or London in 1900. They were filthy places, but they're not any longer. As societies get wealthier, they dedicate resources to clean up. And China and India will probably go through this process more quickly than the Western countries did, because they can take advantage of all the pollution abatement technologies we've now developed, which, of course, in 1900 still didn't exist. So that the dirty phase of industrialization is tending to get shorter with each new country that joins in.
It's hard to understand. Last time I was in China, the air is virtually unbreathable, and yet they're making solar panels instead of building scrubbers to go on their smokestacks, which is known technology. Why have they made that choice?
Well, I think it's because there is widespread enthusiasm for the idea of renewable energy throughout the world, and potentially there's a massive market for it. So it's perfectly sensible to look into the possibilities of solar power and wind power. It's just that so far we haven't yet discovered techniques of doing them on an economically competitive scale. And I expect that so long as the mass production of electricity depends upon fossil fuels, gradually countries like China will start introducing smokestack scrubbers in order to make the fossil fuel dependency a cleaner proposition.
You know, you talk about how filthy the air was in America back in 1900. We don't have to go back that far. I remember growing up in the 50s and 60s how unbreathable the air was in New York or how stinky Boston Harbor was.
Yeah.
If you transported us from the 1960s to today, the environment in and around our big cities would seem fantastically pristine. Have Americans forgotten about the progress we made in less than one lifetime?
I think they have forgotten, or at least some of them have. As you say, people who are old enough to remember how bad the smog used to be in places like Boston and Pittsburgh and Los Angeles are very, very grateful to see how much cleaner the atmosphere is today. But because most citizens don't study history, or at least they don't study atmospheric history, it is very easy for them to forget. And I think we live in a world which also tends to encourage ingratitude. We take the situation we've got for granted and look for continuing problems rather than counting our blessings by comparison with what came to us in the past.
What made all of our environmental progress possible?
There's no question that one of the really good things about the 1950s and 60s is that so many Americans did become indignant about environmental degradation. There really was a lot of pollution of air and rivers. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught fire because the oil on the surface was so bad. There were some terrible oil spills. Rachel Carson alerted us to the danger of indiscriminate use of pesticides and herbicides in her book Silent Spring. And all those things collectively did have the effect of making people right across the political spectrum say, we ought not to have to put up with this. We're now wealthy enough that we can devote some of our resources to cleaning up. And so the Environmental Protection Agency came into existence in 1970. And for a while, people on both sides of the political spectrum voted wholeheartedly in favor of clean air and clean water, wild and scenic rivers, the Endangered Species Act, the elimination of lead from gasoline. All these kinds of things were bipartisan programs. There's no question that we benefit enormously from the fact that that legislation was undertaken and that the agencies have subsequently enforced the rules and made the atmosphere cleaner.
I mean, it was Richard Nixon who launched the EPA.
That's right. If you look at the votes in Congress, they're very, very lopsided in favor of this legislation. And for a while, Republicans were just as enthusiastic as Democrats about environmentalism. Only later did the polarization of environmental politics begin.
What's the key to that polarization?
There was a chronic tendency on the part of environmentalists to exaggerate the danger for the sake of getting things done, and then a growing alarm on the part of particularly businesses that there was too much environmental regulation, and that regulation was going to stifle competition, stifle initiative. Both sides tended to exaggerate. The environmentalists exaggerated how dreadful the situation was, and the businessmen exaggerated how dreadful their prospects were in the face of regulation. But when there's a divided public view of an issue, each of the political parties tends to take one side or the other. So you probably remember that when Reagan became president in the election of 1980, he was at first contemptuous, really, of environmentalism. His Secretary of the Interior was James Watt.
I remember.
His EPA advisor was Ann Gorsuch. And they were scornful of environmentalism. But quite a lot of Republican voters then did protest against this scornful attitude, and Reagan had to backpedal a little bit and restore some integrity to the Interior and to the EPA. But nevertheless, since then, Republican congressmen have remained skeptical, particularly about what they think of as the stifling hand of environmental regulation.
Environmental regulations certainly do seem to be piling up. Have we reached the point of diminishing returns with some of the standards that are being set for things like mercury in the air or other pollutants?
It's very difficult to say. Obviously, these are areas where expert knowledge is needed. It's often true that the last 10% of a cleanup are by far the most expensive. And certain agencies, particularly Superfund for the cleanup of toxic waste sites, was widely criticized for having such high standards that the ground they were repairing could almost be safely consumed. It could be eaten without severe damage. On the other hand, the good thing about regulation is that it sets new standards and it creates a lot of new entrepreneurial opportunities. In other words, all sorts of businesses have now got an incentive to see the standards be set high because they can then produce the technologies with which businesses are able to comply. It isn't the case that business is all on one side of this. It's on both sides. And so long as the regulation doesn't become downright mendacious, I think on the whole it's defensible.
So, Patrick, your book states that the American environmental movement grew out of our fears of nuclear holocaust. I certainly remember the H-bomb drills we did in elementary school and the first Earth Day in high school. What gives existential fear its capacity to cloud our reasoning ability and empower charismatic doomsayers?
One of the many things that was so astonishing about Hiroshima and Nagasaki was their destructive power, and the sudden realization after World War II that you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Once the nuclear weapons were in the world, they were here to stay, and so then it became vitally important to control them. I mean, on the one hand, to continue developing them in the context of the Cold War, on the other hand, to make sure they weren't actually used. So there was a long and fascinating period when the Russians and the Americans had an interest in each knowing what the other one was doing. They'd got a persistent antagonism, but they'd also got a persistent common interest in making sure the bombs weren't used. Throughout Western history, there's always been a fascination with the idea of the end of the world. Until 1945, the assumption always was that it had to be done by divine intervention. But suddenly, it became possible to imagine that people could do it to themselves through greed or stupidity or violence. In other words, there really was an apocalyptic threat. And I think that then what happened is that people began transferring that sense of possible catastrophe to other issues. The most influential book about population was called The Population Bomb by a man called Paul Ehrlich. And I think he was borrowing the idea of the nuclear bomb and saying population can have the same kind of catastrophic effect.
Well, take us through some of the greatest hits of apocalyptic prediction. You know, we survived the Cold War. The population bomb has fizzled. People are more worried now about depopulating some of the Western democracies. What about our fear of cancer-causing chemicals?
Yes, a very influential book from the 70s called The Politics of Cancer by a doctor called Samuel Epstein made the claim that every year we were bringing hundreds of new chemicals into the world without proper testing, and that many of them were carcinogenic. So he said the reason for the rising rate of cancer in the world is because the chemical industries are killing us with indiscriminate use of these chemicals. The answer to that came from people like Edith Ephron, who said, no, it's true that cancer rates are increasing, but the reason they're increasing is because more and more people are living longer and longer lives, and cancer mainly affects people in their later decades. So weirdly, it's a kind of backhanded compliment to the successes we've had in keeping people alive long enough that they can survive to get cancer. I mean, obviously, the sad news is that in the end, the Grim Reaper will get you anyway. But the good news is that you've got much better prospects of living into your 60s and 70s than any previous generation. And certainly Epstein's claims that cancer was being created mainly by environmental carcinogens hasn't stood the test of time. It's a far more complicated picture than that, the etiology of cancer.
What about some of the other greatest hits? Remember our peak oil mania that we went through for a while?
That's right, that every time there's a spike in the price of petroleum, the claim is made that there isn't much left in the earth and that we're running out of it once and for all, and that we'll have to pay more and more to get the little bit that remains. And then each of these spikes is followed by a long period where the price goes down, including the most recent one, and then we're forced to acknowledge, first of all, that we don't quite know how much oil is left in the earth, and that there's no sign at all of it actually being in short supply. I suppose the most dramatic example of this, again, Paul Ehrlich, who I mentioned a minute ago, was a great believer in the 1970s, not only that the population was too great, but also that we were running out of natural resources and we're going to face famines in all these materials by 2000. And again, of course, people like you and me who lived through the year 2000 know how untrue that was.
We missed out on that one. Do you remember the scare that high-voltage electric power lines were causing leukemia? Yes,
that's another one. I think what tends to happen is that scientists undertake experiments and find interesting correlations, and they tend to express their discoveries in very, very cautious language. But then journalists extrapolate from the articles and give a sensational version, which very often the scientists certainly hadn't intended in the first place. Just as we're constantly being bombarded with misleading claims about which foods are good for us or bad for us, so we're being bombarded with claims about things in our world which seem to make life more convenient actually being terribly bad for us.
Remember when the apple industry was almost destroyed by the Allitt scare?
That's right. Allitt was a chemical which the apple growers used to help the apples look good and to ripen at the right moment. and exaggerated claims by the National Resources Defense Council led to apples being withdrawn altogether from school lunches and from supermarkets, and certainly caused a sort of year-long dip in apple sales. Luckily, the industry was able to recover. And I think what happened there is that the TV show 60 Minutes first accepted the scare and did a story about that, but then realized that they'd overreacted and did a second story retracting the claim. That's an interesting case where the journalists themselves realized that they'd overdone it.
Well, they got to sell advertising on 2 shows.
Yeah, I suppose you could take a cynical view. I mean, as I've studied these things, my impression is that it isn't as though anybody's acting in bad faith. In other words, the various parties to these debates believe that what they're saying is true. It's just that they're often not sufficiently skeptical about the claims they're making. They get carried away, first of all, by overconfidence in their own findings, and also by dread of a terrible future.
Why is it so hard to debunk these scares? Let's take a look at the anti-vaccine movement. We had a scare for a while that autism might be caused by thimerosal vaccines. That seems to have been deeply disproven, and yet the anti-vaxxers are still at it. What can end that scare?
It's very difficult, isn't it, to end them, because the presentation of evidence to show that the scare is false is simply taken to be part of the great conspiracy. There are people who make themselves immune to disproof, and I think that's a very good example, that there isn't any evidence to support the idea that vaccines cause autism, and yet there's this persistent claim by all sorts of people who've brought themselves to believe it, that anyone who says the opposite is a dangerous deceiver.
Well, the elephant in the room of undisprovable claims is global warming. In your book, you state that climate predictions made today tell us much more about the people who are making them than about the future they purport to describe. How so?
Because I'm a historian, when somebody makes a claim about the future, my instinct is always to look to the past. And by now, we've got a long history of predictions of the future, and what they have in common is an incredible failure rate. They're always wrong, and they're always wrong in very interesting ways. So if you look at predictions made in 1950 about what the year 2000 was going to be like, they'll tell you a lot about what people were thinking about in 1950, but nothing at all about what the world was like in 2000. I mean, I remember that Life magazine did a story in 1950 about what the world would be like in 50 years, and it said, Dad will go to work in his nuclear-powered hovercraft,
right,
and Mom will stay at home with her nuclear-powered kitchen, and she won't have to worry about doing the dishes because the robot will do it all. And of course, it was all sort of what was new and exciting in 1949 and 50. What it doesn't talk about is the civil rights movement. It doesn't talk about computers. It doesn't talk about the transformation of gender relations. It doesn't talk about the trip to the moon. All the really interesting things that actually happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s are completely, scanted. And of course they are, because those things hadn't happened yet. I mean, there's something very odd about climate change, because unlike most of these predictions, it doesn't have any immediate group who are suffering from it. For example, with the population, it was true that large numbers of people were suffering from famine in 1960, and therefore the fear was that if the population gets bigger, more people will suffer from famine. But on the other hand, what we haven't had in recent years is people suffering from climate change, and yet we do still have the claim that climate change is going to hurt more and more people with the passage of time. I mean, in that sense, it's a little bit different from these earlier scares.
One of the most alarming aspects of the global warming crisis is the idea that human activity is pushing the Earth towards a tipping point, after which nothing could save us. It's much like the second coming for the early Christians. This tipping point keeps moving, but it still has a very strong hold on the public imagination. As a historian who's seen things like this before, how long do you predict the idea of a tipping point will remain ascendant?
I think it's reasonable to believe that the idea will persist. But every time somebody tries to predict exactly when it's going to happen, they're always shown to be wrong, just as attempts to predict when Jesus is going to return in glory have always been shown to be wrong. And the idea of the tipping point is rhetorically useful because it enables people to say, these changes may look as though they're just very slight and very gradual and very incremental, but suddenly everything will be different. In other words, if you reject the idea of a tipping point, then you're faced with the idea of continuous gradual change into the indefinite future, which is actually very similar to the continuous gradual change that we've had in the past.
Right.
I think one of the common fallacies at the moment is the idea that the world's climate was stable until very recently, and that's simply not true. We know that in historic time, in the last 1,000 years, there have been warm periods and there have been cold periods. And we also know that these can't have been caused by industrial activity because there wasn't enough of it. And therefore, climate change is something we've been continuously adapting to for hundreds of years. It's not something which is brand new.
In all the various histories predicting environmental doom that you've studied, have you ever seen a case in which skeptics have been so thoroughly demonized as they have been in global warming, to the point where some activists are even suggesting that vocal non-believers be criminally prosecuted?
Well, there is this recent idea that the executives of Exxon ought to be prosecuted. What tends to happen in all these intellectual and policy debates is that everybody thinks the worst of their antagonists. But the idea that you can also bring the law to bear against them, perhaps that is something new. One of the very interesting things of the last few decades is the successful prosecutions of the tobacco companies. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty clear that they did know that smoking was very harmful and they did suppress the evidence. And so by analogy, it's possible to speculate about doing the same kind of thing with the oil companies. The great difference, of course, is that oil has got enormous benefits for the whole world, whereas smoking didn't have any benefits for anyone except the people who actually smoked, who loved it.
Well, it's also pretty clear that the medical evidence is irrefutable when it comes to cigarettes causing cancer, and there's no such evidence yet that supports the computer models that are predicting doom.
Exactly. So all the difference in the world, and I think that's why we can be very confident that Exxon is not going to be prosecuted, or that if it is, it's going to be found not guilty.
As we move into the future, how can we best nurture our optimism when we're surrounded by prophets of doom?
I think by studying history and by recognizing how much better the present is than the past. One of the great temptations we always have in thinking about the past is to kind of indulge in nostalgia. And obviously shows like, Downton Abbey play into that because they give the impression that living in the past was better than living in the present. But what they'd never do in Downton Abbey is go to the dentist or sort of die prematurely of infections that we can now cure. Life in previous ages was very, very hard indeed, and we'd find it just absolutely intolerable. So although we need to keep an eye on the various problems which confront our world, we also need to keep an eye on the fact that we're living in far more secure circumstances than any of our predecessors, and that it's mainly through industrialization that we've created these superior conditions.
Well, Patrick, I'll keep that in mind next time someone passes me with a sandwich board telling me the end is near. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Sure, great pleasure.
That was Emory Professor of History Patrick Allitt, author of Climate of Crisis, America in the Age of Environmentalism, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program now broadcast in 11 cities and online. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, sign up for updates on realclearradio.org. And if you'd like to help us bring more guests like this on the air, please hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.